Hi, Ashley. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Well, I want to thank Ashley, Sarah, and Rosemary for organizing this and for the Punishment and Society Research Network of the Law and Society Association for inviting me to do this and for offering this opportunity to use this unusual technology to share our research. I'm excited to be able to talk to so many of you from far away. This talk today is based off of my new book, Addicted to Rehab, from Rutgers University Press. It draws on ethnographic research that I conducted in addiction treatment programs for women, comparing one in the criminal justice system to one in the healthcare system. And rehab is in the news these days, much more so than when I started my research. This is largely because of the opioid epidemic. But even before this moment, addiction treatment had been central to efforts to reduce incarceration and reform drug policy. So you can see here that it was a centerpiece of Obama's drug control strategy. This is a screenshot from the Obama White House's Drug Czar's webpage, which highlights expanding access for treatment. And you can see that by 2014, Obamacare, as it's come to be called, required health insurance plans to include treatment for substance use disorders as an essential health benefit. And so this expanded access to some forms of treatment. It seems like Trump's tax bill will undermine this expanded access, but the support for treatment is bipartisan and may yet persist under this regime. So you can see that among Republicans, such as Chris Christie, the former governor of New Jersey, treatment also has a lot of support. He made expanding treatment the primary focus of his last 2 years in office. So Chris Christie told a reporter, "Incarceration just hasn't worked. We need to treat it as a disease. And not having mandatory incarceration for nonviolent offenders, but having mandatory treatment is something that's going to yield a much greater result for society in general and for those individuals in particular." And this is the typical framing. Addiction is a disease, and thus prisons are not appropriate. Drug users need treatment. Various commentators have noted that the response to the opioid epidemic is much more sympathetic, much more focused on treatment than on punishment, in comparison to the crack epidemic in the 80s and 90s, when you saw incredibly punitive response. And these commentators note that this is because the drug users, currently opioid users, are constructed as white, whereas crack users were constructed as Black. But today I want to argue that addiction treatment was already an important mode of governance, especially for marginalized groups and within punishment. drug treatment was very much part of the punitive turn. So the penal state is central to the addiction treatment field. 1/3 of all referrals to treatment come from the criminal justice system. And until about 2014, they were the single largest source of referrals. You also see that public funds account for a huge majority of treatment spending compared to a small amount from health insurance. And many recent ethnographic studies of punishment and penal institutions, including my own, find that, that a lot of these institutions use ideas, discourses, and techniques from the recovery field. Even things like police or reentry centers that are not officially dedicated to addiction treatment. So for this book, I did ethnographic research in 2 addiction treatment programs for women. They were both residential, but one was in the criminal justice system and one was in the healthcare system. In them, I found different definitions of addiction and different modes of treatment. So based on my findings, I'm going to caution us about our eagerness to use the notion of addiction to understand and manage social problems. I argue that it extends the power of punitive policies and the race, class, and gender politics that underlie them. So I'm going to introduce you to my study by telling you about some women who ended up in rehab but took different pathways there. Sarah was in her late 30s, white, and a nurse. She wrote herself illegal prescriptions for opioids. Sarah funded her habit by stealing thousands of dollars from her elderly father. Eventually, a suspicious pharmacist contacted the doctor whose script she was using, and he didn't know what she was doing, but he covered for her to protect her nursing license. He also called her husband. Together, they staged an intervention, and the doctor promised not to report Sarah if she got help. And then he recommended that she attend a rehab that I call Gladstone Lodge. Sarah was lucky to spend 28 days at the lodge, which is the longest stretch of residential treatment that her insurance would cover. And Sarah felt awful about what she'd done. But she told me she found solace at the lodge where she met 4 other nurses. This made her, quote, feel like a person and reassured her that she was not so bad. Marisol also ended up at Gladstone Lodge. She was in her 50s and of Puerto Rican descent. She was a member of a utility workers union and was caught drunk at work. Her supervisor and her employer then made her go to treatment in order to keep her job. But her union's benefits were generous, and so she also got a month in treatment. At the lodge, Marisol spent her time talking about her drinking patterns, and the counselors told her that she deserved to get sober so that she could enjoy her retirement pension. The lodge staff even had her union representative pick her up when she was done and when she was discharged from the program and drive her directly to an AA meeting. On the other hand, Christine was a Black woman in her 20s who ended up in rehab because of a drug court. It had sentenced her for 1 year to a program that I'm calling Women's Treatment Services, or WTS for short. And this separated her from her children. Because Christine struggled with this, she was asked to join WTS's parenting class, where 1 week I heard her happily announce that she'd gotten a job. She wanted to get her life back together, and so she was excited about the job. But a week later, she told me that WTS had made her quit. This was because staff said she, quote, wasn't getting any treatment due to her working hours. They wanted Christine to focus on therapeutic work on herself. Danisha was also a woman who ended up at WTS. She was in her late 30s and, like Christine, from a poor background. Danisha's pathway started after she gave birth and tested positive for an illegal drug. The hospital reported her to Child Protective Services, which placed her baby in foster care. And if she wanted to get custody back over her daughter, she would have to complete 1 year of treatment at WTS. This made her one of the only clients there without a criminal justice mandate, although she did face a great deal of coercion with the loss of her daughter hanging over her head. She proudly described herself to me as voluntary and seemed to enjoy distinguishing herself from the criminal label applied to most of her peers. But Danisha was actually quite similar to these other women. She'd been in prison before, and she faced legal coercion. She wanted to focus on getting a job, getting a GED, reuniting with her baby, but these priorities came into conflict with those of the WTS staff. And Denisha said the staff made her feel like a fuck up and asked her to degrade herself. Eventually, she absconded from the program. These women's pathways to treatment and each of the program's structures and their referral networks can tell you a lot about the way social institutions use rehab. So WTS is a community-based alternative to incarceration program. It's located in a low-income urban neighborhood. It's a nonprofit that's funded mostly by the criminal justice and welfare system, so that would include things like TANF and homeless services. Meanwhile, Gladstone Lodge is about 2-hour drive away, and it's in a rural area. It's a private for-profit business, a kind of classic 12-step rehab. It has no formal ties to the criminal justice system, and it's funded through health insurance or self-payment. So it doesn't take any public funding of any kind, including Medicaid, state grants, federal grants, etc. It costs $9,000 a month. During my research, it's gone up a little bit since then. And you should note that this is cheap for a private pay rehab. It's a kind of modest place. It's not the sort of fancy rehab where celebrities go for treatment. But there are some similarities as well. So they're both residential. They are located in the same northeastern state. They are licensed by the same state agency. They're both women only, and they claim to use gender-sensitive methods. The staff at each place was fairly similar. They were mostly licensed substance abuse counselors, which is a certification, a state certification that doesn't require a college degree, just some courses and a test, as well as clinical experience. And like most rehabs, they require total abstinence. So both of these facilities did not use medication for the treatment of addiction to opioids like methadone or buprenorphine. I want to situate these in their context, not because I claim that they're representative of criminal justice or private pay rehabs, but I selected them to differ across a theoretically important angle, their relationship to the penal state, to see how this shapes treatment. And it does. It ends up creating a bifurcated system in which rehabs are embedded in different institutions and power relationships. So I'm going to show you a little bit about the consequences of this for each program. WTS gets its referrals from drug courts and parole mostly. There are also women who have cases with Child Protective Services or CPS. Some women have both, so they could both end up in prison and lose custody of their children if they were to fail in treatment. Their referral sources also, of course, mean that the population reflects the race and class disparities in the criminal justice system. So you see that WTS is majority Black and Latina with a small minority of white women. And most of those women are very low income. The state funds quite a lot of services at WTS. This makes it a kind of best case scenario of what you could expect from community-based penal rehab. So, for instance, women could have access to remedial education, GED preparation, vocational assistance, trauma therapy, parenting classes, housing placement, etc. But things are pretty different in the private sector. So Gladstone Lodge, in order to get clients, it contracts not just with insurance companies, but also with employers and labor unions. This means a lot of women go there in order to avoid losing their jobs. Others are pushed into treatment by their families, often like after an intervention or some other kind of crisis. They also can just find this rehab on the web, so it has to compete in the rehab market. And then finally, CPS also sends some women to Gladstone Lodge for exactly the same kind of reason, in which they have to complete treatment in order to get custody of their children. This was the only pathway to treatment that overlapped between the two facilities that I studied. At the same time, this also produces class and race differences from WTS in its population. So almost the inverse of WTS, it's a vast majority white with small minorities of Black and Latina women. The women there are mostly working to middle class. This is partly because of its heavy union presence in its client population. But despite their better off social circumstances, Gladstone Lodge is incredibly constrained by being in the healthcare market. So insurance companies will only fund 1 month at most of treatment, and even that can be like pulling teeth. They have to struggle often to get that much coverage for their clients. It also means that the lodge can't offer any of these ancillary services like vocational assistance or legal assistance. Ultimately, the rehab that a person ends up in has little to do with the nature or severity of their drug use. In fact, WTS women did not necessarily have worse drug problems than lodge women. Many of WTS women did have years of heavy drug use, but some were mostly dealers who'd gotten mandated to treatment. Others were recreational users who'd gotten caught by the law and were also poor. Some women were sent to WTS because they became homeless and violated parole. Parole sent one woman I met there to WTS because she, quote, needed structure. Others were referred because they had trauma from sexual violence, and their parole officers thought that this contributed to their criminal behavior. WTS ended up being a place where poor women could get treatment for many things, many kinds of needs, whether that's housing, trauma, as well as substance use. So WTS clients actually could get more services at this program than they could in any other social welfare agency. It's remarkable how much more generous the American penal system is compared to its healthcare system. Women's pathways to WTS also show that state agencies are using addiction treatment to manage more than just drug use or crime. They're using it to respond to poverty, gender violence, homelessness, and a whole set of other social problems. I call this trend governing through addiction. I'm riffing off of Jonathan Simon's term governing through crime here, and suggest that we govern through addiction when we use the idea of addiction as a key framework to explain social problems and use treatment to manage them. So the employers, unions, parole, welfare, drug courts, or CPS officers who are all sending women to treatment at the places I studied are governing through addiction. And they do so to accomplish various ends. They send people to treatment in order to control crime, make people employable, deal with domestic violence, manage risk, or improve worker productivity. This isn't only happening in the criminal justice system, but it is a key site where you see governing through addiction. This strategy ends up rearranging links between the penal system and the welfare system, expanding access to services through a kind of rehab-based safety net. But in order to gain access to this safety net, people must be criminalized. So by observing daily life in these two programs, I found that these institutional relationships shaped the ways the programs defined addiction and the kinds of therapeutic techniques that they used. So I'm going to start with WTS. Yvonne was the legal services director there, and she explained to me that clients at WTS were so broken, they, quote, didn't even have a self yet. So they needed habilitation, not rehabilitation. When she said this, it was the first time I'd heard that word, habilitation. If you've read other ethnographies of treatment programs, such as that by Jill McCorkle, you will have heard this word before. But when I started my research there in 2004, this was news to me. Habilitation posits that addiction is the result of a disordered self. It's characteristic of the kind of drug treatment program that gets called the therapeutic community. And it means that treatment requires a kind of total remaking of the self because addicts are so dysfunctional that there's nothing in them to rehabilitate. It ends up being the dominant method of treatment in the criminal justice system because it's seen as tough. So for instance, if you go to the New York State's Department of Corrections website, it says that it, quote, is responsible for the confinement and habilitation of offenders. Rehabilitation is not mentioned. Research suggests that men's habilitation programs require confrontation. They expect men to get jobs, take responsibility, submit to orders, and control their emotions. However, Yvonne thought that that approach may help men, but you can't always do that with women because they come in with so much trauma. They just haven't been able to establish healthy relationships, she told me. Quote, we can probably just cuss the men out all day, but for women, this traumatizes them further. For WTS staff then, the source of women's problems was what the director called their addiction to pain and punishment. They thought drug use, crime, prostitution, dropping out of school, poverty, abusive boyfriends were merely symptoms of the real problem, which was women's profoundly dependent self. Transforming this self was the aim of treatment at WTS, and this was why Christine could not keep her job. Here's another example. So Belinda was a woman at WTS. Her counselor, Rachel, reported on concerns about her at a staff meeting. Rachel said that Belinda was, quote, not coming from her gut in their recent sessions because she was worried about her son, who was having behavioral difficulties in school. It was bad enough that CPS had visited the home, but the boy's grandmother didn't speak English, and so she couldn't advocate for him to get any extra services from the school. And Belinda felt awful about this. She wanted to step in. She'd asked for permission to visit the school and to get her son's services. Rachel was frustrated at the whole situation. She said that Belinda should, quote, focus on herself before advocating for her child. Another counselor suggested that the staff should determine whether Belinda's concern was due to what she called her guilt or a, quote, real problem of the son being underserved. As Rachel described Belinda, the conversation among the staff turned to what she'd been wearing. Various staff members compared stories of seeing Belinda wearing a large, dumpy beige sweater. They decided that this must be signs of emotional problems, probably issues with her weight. One counselor reported seeing her eat at unusual times and said she must be a compulsive eater. In the end, they decided that her counselor would contact the school to see if the problem was real. Belinda was not allowed to visit the school or call. Moreover, Rachel decided that she would counsel Belinda about her body image. In this example, the staff assumed that Belinda's relationship with herself was the primary cause of her problems. So her social marginalization was rendered invisible. Her concerns about her son and the school were merely signs of her possible pathologies. At WTS, treatment then meant going deep. Doing that, focusing on the self that was so central, meant exposing one's degrading past, identifying family pathology. Ultimately, the staff wanted to fix women's selves and believed that this needed to happen before the women could mother their children or work or re-enter society more generally. So to take Kate for an example, she had all the trappings of success she was not using. So her drug tests are clean. She had a job. She was in training to be an administrative assistant, and she'd already started looking for an apartment. The court actually released her from her mandate early because of these accomplishments, and she was very eager to leave. Her main counselor, Lucy, reported that Kate's explanation for the flurry of activity was that she was, quote, at her best when she was productive. But Lucy thought that Kate was in trouble. This was because she presented with the, quote, same behaviors and was not working on internal issues. She listed other problems. Kate makes impulse purchases, manipulates, is cocky, and gives away money to feel superior. As the conversation wound down, the staffers dismissed Kate's concentration on work as merely a desire for validation. She was what recovery lingo would call codependent, because she needed outside sources of meaning and self-esteem. Lucy ultimately decided that Kate should follow up with WTS's aftercare program, even after she had left the residential component, but we learned that Kate declined to do this. And this account of her cockiness, declining aftercare, was the final straw for Marcus, who was the senior program director. He stood up and yelled at the staff. Kate's lack of readiness showed the failure of WTS, he thought. Marcus claimed that this woman was leaving, quote, with the same issues going out as coming in, because they'd sent her out to work too early. Marcus said they shouldn't have allowed Kate to work at a job if she wasn't working on treatment. She can't use vocational services and not do treatment, he hollered. He declared Kate a waste of time. Kate could have been a success story. She was meeting the norms about how poor people should act and what it would mean to be a responsible, independent citizen. Yet WTS staffers did not agree. It was because women's problems was in their selves. As a result, women's interest in non-therapeutic services was regularly seen as manipulation of the program. Women were not allowed to determine their own needs. Ultimately, the goal of learning about this disordered self was to shed one's dependency on those external sources of meaning, pleasure, and validation. So not just drugs, although that too, but work, men, family, children. To overcome this dependency on outside sources, women had to learn to need nothing but themselves, to be happy with just themselves. WTS's language of dependency and manipulation draws from racist tropes about welfare queens and the pathological dependent Black poor. Their definition of addiction resembles the culture of poverty thesis, dressed up in therapeutic garb. But it was not a financial dependence on the state that really worried the staff. Within addiction discourse, it became a dependent self. This version of treatment not only reinscribes racial stigma, it hinged on coercive penal control that gave WTS enormous power over its clients. So if WTS women had to change their selves, at the Lodge, women had to change their lifestyles. Their solutions were different because at the Lodge, addiction meant substance abuse, not a disordered self. Gladstone Lodge focused on getting women to stop using. The staff wanted clients to recognize that substance abuse was their most important problem. They had to learn to use the 12 steps to live a sober life. The clinical director at Gladstone Lodge, Annette, realized that people had other issues like trauma, family problems, financial issues, but these things were not her job, he thought. Quote, "For us, it is about chemical dependency." Counselor Mary also explained to me that the Lodge's focus was on substance abuse. The Lodge didn't try to address all the other issues that women might have. Clients could be overwhelmed, she cautioned. Plus, you need time to put people back together again. Annette agreed with this statement. Quote, "We're not doing intensive psychotherapy. We don't have the time to do that, and we don't have the training to do that." Ultimately, insurance limited the time and the range of services that the Lodge had. But the staffers' statements suggest that they also define women's problems differently. They don't actually think that women need this kind of intensive treatment. So it's not just the structural constraints of the healthcare system, but a broader idea about what women needed that narrowed the scope of addiction at Gladstone Lodge compared to WTS. One technique will help illustrate this distinction between the two programs. So telling one's story, one's life story, is a major part of treatment at both these programs. It's a classic part of AA and NA, and is incorporated into treatment a lot in the rehab world. But at WTS and the Lodge, the expected content and form of these life narratives differed. So WTS wanted narratives of trauma and women seeking their own degradation, followed by growing self-love due to WTS's treatment. Yet at Gladstone Lodge, when Marisol told her story, she spent a long time describing her horrendously abusive parents and how her mother forced her to have an illegal abortion. It was graphic and heartrending, just the kind of gut-level anguish that WTS would have wanted to hear from women. But after a while of Marisol describing her abusive family and how she felt unloved, the counselor leaned forward to instruct her, "Talk about your drinking." Ultimately, Annette, one of the lead counselors there and clinical director, felt that deep stuff like abuse, these kinds of issues, was for aftercare, when clients could see a psychologist. She said, quote, "The other danger of that, of going so deep, is letting them get too caught up in it and too focused on it, and they lose the whole program. I would say let them learn how to live one day at a time without the chemical and just deal with the daily stresses. Some people will go the rest of their lives without deep work, and they'll just be fine." But of course, Lodge clients did actually struggle with the past and worry about their futures. The staffers there knew that many women had histories of sexual violence or unequal relationships with men that helped to fuel their substance use. They believed that women actually used to cope with these problems, especially these kinds of gendered problems. But rather than cultivate relationships with yourself, like they did at WTS, the lodge told women to take it one day at a time, to leave it on the mountain. A sign saying that hung in the main room where therapeutic groups were held at the lodge. The lodge also asked women to keep a God box. These were little unfinished wooden boxes that women could paint and decorate during their time for crafts. They were instructed to write down their worries and fears on little pieces of paper and then to put them in the God box, quote, for God to take care of. So they could focus on staying sober. Staying sober meant learning a new 12-step based lifestyle. This is what they called working the program. It consists of daily habits of moral self-improvement. Most importantly, working the program required that they had to identify as addicts and alcoholics, avoid selfishness, and rely on the fellowship of other women in 12-step groups. Here are some sayings from 12-step culture, which you can, from them, you can get a sense of the sort of the condemning of selfishness and self-pity, the idea of not worrying about other things and putting staying sober first, and a resistance to digging deep, that analysis means paralysis, and that you should take things one day at a time. The staff often tried to convince clients that substance abuse was actually the cause of their problems, that they should focus on that before all their other concerns. So during one session, the lead counselor, Ruth, began by asking the women, who has tried to get clean before? And all but one woman in the room raised her hand. What happened? Ruth asked. One woman then offered that she switched addictions to another drug. A second said, I didn't work a program. Ruth responded, quote, people come here because of the consequences. If there were no consequences, there would be no Gladstone Lodge. She explained that, quote, to keep using despite negative results was the definition of insanity. And Ruth then engaged them in an exercise to convince them of their insanity. She asked them to, quote, go back to a time where there were no consequences. How many years of consequences do you have? She requested a volunteer. And there was an awkward pause. And finally, a client said, 30 years. I was 17. After describing her consequences, Ruth responded, that might stop somebody normal, implying that those negative consequences would not stop an addict. She wrote 30 on the board and asked for someone to add up the years, and I volunteered. As each woman gave her count and her explanation of her negative consequences, I added the numbers. It eventually came to 159 years of insanity for the whole group. Ruth asked me to divide it, and I announced that it came to just under 20 years a person. She dryly pointed out that this was a big number, and several women looked alarmed. From the lodge's point of view, the clients may not be normal, but it was using that was the problem, not the entire self. But take the example of Alexa. Alexa was a 20-year-old white heroin user who was the only woman at the lodge with a real criminal justice mandate from probation. She also had health insurance. She'd been in rehab 8 times before, including in penal rehabs, using the therapeutic community model of habilitation, and she described them to me with horror. While she was at the lodge, Alexa had to leave for a medical procedure, and the staff worried that she would use while she was outside of the facility. She'd done it in other rehabs. Plus, the staff thought that knew that her mother was driving her to the appointment, and they considered her mother codependent and an especially difficult woman. They had to figure out what to do to prevent this from happening. So when it came down to making this decision, the staff's strategies focused on making sure Alexa didn't use. She was to tell her doctor that she was an addict, so she would not be given pain medication, and her mother was instructed to drive her right back to the lodge. Despite Alexa's actual criminal status and her problematic family, the staff didn't press her to go deep or to dissociate with her mother. They wanted to prevent Alexa from using. When she'd transferred from that penal rehab to the lodge, she became a different kind of addict. And I know that's a stigmatizing word, addict. The lodge staff called clients addicts and alcoholics all the time. But the lodge made this not a degraded identity. It was not burdened with the racial, criminal, or gendered stigmas that it came with at WTS. In fact, the Lodge worked hard to destigmatize the addict identity, including freeing women from the kind of sexist stigmas that were placed on women who used drugs. One way the Lodge did this was to present addiction as an alien entity, not who they were, not the whole self. So in one group, the clients read a letter from their addiction, part of which is excerpted here on the slide. And a letter was written like addiction was a cruel and controlling lover. As our relationship grows, you'll start to exclude others from your life. You know that I can give you all you need. I'll be your lover, best friend, and confidant who will always be available when you need me. You will come running to me. I've got you where I want you. Now you have no choice. You cannot live without me, and I'll love it. They found this very powerful, the clients. Grace ended up describing her addiction as, quote, a bad dude. You know, in the end, he's going to beat you. Another technique of depicting addiction as an alien entity was that the clients watched a video that described addiction as a sleeping tiger inside of them. It was this sort of strange bootleg video in which addiction was represented by hand-drawn pictures of sleeping tigers coiled inside people's bellies. And the video told the women that the tiger was awakened by using, but it could go to sleep when they were living a sober life. There was a picture of a tiger in the main room where therapeutic groups were held at the Lodge in order to remind women of this peril. Like many treatment programs, most of the Lodge staff were also in recovery. This was probably true of many WTS staffers too, but they didn't talk about it very much. In fact, the Lodge staff talked about it all the time. They adopted this label too, the label of addict or alcoholic, and they worked to turn it into a kind of special status. So for instance, the staff would tell their own stories of using and recovery during group, and they would compare notes about the difficult parts of recovery. They made it clear that being an addict was not a kind of degraded status. It was actually sort of special because they were wise from their suffering and enlightened about how to live. It was a bit like being born again. So counselor Francine once said to the women that she felt bad for the normies out there winging it without what we have, meaning the 12 steps and the fellowship it provided with other women. The Lodge staff really wanted to offer the women in their care the salvation that they themselves had experienced. But they also had to navigate, they could not avoid the class and race politics around drugs that came with the punitive rhetoric we associate with mass incarceration and the war on drugs. So redeeming their clients required making distinctions between addicts. Gladstone Lodge's founders were a married couple I call Bill and Faye, and they were very opposed to taking state funding. Although they had once accepted Medicaid, they were proud that they didn't anymore. Avoiding public funding and contracting with unions were attempts to seek out what they considered the best clients, what Bill called the cream of the crop. And this is a distinction that was filled with race and class meaning. So Don, the financial director of the Lodge, claimed that other treatment programs were jealous of the Lodge because it monopolized the, quote, best accounts, which were the unions. He said that the unions had good insurance coverage and, quote, jobs to go back to. Numerous staff members described their clients to me as decent working people. I heard this all the time. But they did not see the people who came to treatment through other routes, especially through the criminal justice system, as so honorable. They were not decent working people. So relying on public funding, being poor, became a sign of unruliness and unworthiness, a different kind of addict. For instance, Bill invoked race when he complained about the, quote, off-the-street attitude and gold chains of Medicaid clients. Calling up long-held ideas about the Black poor, he suggested that they were, quote, not highly motivated and acted as if they had a right to entitlement. They were just using the system, he said. Don ended up explaining to me that those sorts of people, those other kinds of addicts, needed to be habilitated, not rehabilitated. And habilitation was an approach he found unnecessary for Lodge clients. So in conclusion, the Lodge promised its clients salvation, not only from substance abuse, but also from the sexist, racist, and classist stigmas that we associate with criminal addicts. And it worked to fit women back into their lives, viewing the women as entitled to help and the company of fellow women and in recovery. But at this lodge, or at WTS, women were promised other things. They were promised autonomy, they were promised self-esteem, but to do this, they were required to change their entire selves, to confess their deepest hurts, to discard their old identities and withdraw from their past relationships and social life. In sum, they had to learn to expect nothing from the world around them. While WTS offers needed services to poor women, governing them through addiction suspended their citizenship in ways that are entirely analogous to more traditional punishments. The program's racialized and gendered version of addiction was profoundly stigmatizing and ended up extending the reach of penal control to new areas of their selves and their lives. Ultimately, WTS rendered women responsible for the abuse and deprivation that they had suffered. But I argue that it's not the women who are addicted to punishment, it's the system around them. Thank you. Yeah, so the staff. I spent a long time trying to think about the staff and why their strategies made sense to them. The staff at each program resembled the race and class backgrounds of the women in the programs. So they were mostly African-American at WTS and mostly white working class women at the lodge. They were mostly state licensed substance abuse counselors. There was only a couple of sort of people with advanced degrees at each program. And like I said, I suspect that many of them had been in recovery themselves. I know that for sure about the lodge because they were so open about it and they talked about it all the time. But the women who worked at WTS and the few men who worked at WTS, I'm less clear about that. So that's kind of their professional background and their demographics. And part of why I think they do what they do, if that's what you're interested, if you're interested in, is that many of these strategies are kind of built into recovery logic. So they've come up through it either through their training or through their own personal recovery, and they're very familiar with these techniques. There's a long tradition in the addiction treatment world of people moving up into counselor positions, even in the same organizations that they were clients in. This was not the case at WTS, but the lodge did have counselors who had been clients at the lodge. And in some therapeutic community style, habilitation style programs, you also see this kind of movement into counselor positions. And so one of the reasons why I think that they might have different orientations towards addiction is not just some unknown difference in their professional training, but that they themselves have come up through these sort of two ends of the system and carry forward that kind of logic. So I'm tackling Ashley's question about the state. Yes, well, I guess I think of the penal state as being more than just the criminal justice system, but as being the kind of contemporary state, including welfare state institutions within the larger state, and think of sort of the penal state or carceral state, whichever term you prefer, as a way of referring to the sort of era we're in which punitive strategies towards the poor are a kind of dominant mode of governance. So I'm using it in that sense. And WTF link between these two ends of the state. And so that's part of how I think of this organization as kind of reflecting, we seem to have lost, oh, there we go. As I think of this organization as kind of reflecting the policies and practices of both sort of aspects, both the welfare state and the criminal justice system. So that's one place where I see the state. They do things differently than other state institutions, like you got the example of Kate, for instance, where WTS staffers disagreed with the drug treatment court, which was happy to release her from the mandate, and they weren't. So obviously there's not uniform or seamless coordination or ideological similarity across different aspects of the state in this program. But what you do see is the use of addiction discourse increasingly. Since I started the work, you now have attempts to have drug testing for welfare clients in states around the country, in which case going to treatment would be required in order to retain access to services, or benefits. So I think you might actually see this spreading further, this kind of use of rehab to discipline behavioral problems, to enforce compliance, and to sort of root out criminal behavior among the poor. Does that help to... Oh, you asked about the women being stripped of citizenship as well. Yeah, well, I guess they still, to the extent that they're still, say under parole supervision, there are actual legal regulations on their, say, ability to vote or other things like that. But the organization WTS is working to keep women away from their existing lives, to prevent women from accessing employment, sexual and family relationships. And so it withdraws them from society in many similar ways. Obviously, it is not as totalizing as you would find in a proper prison. It's located in the community. It's not a locked facility. Women could just walk out the door if they wanted to. And officially, the goal is to have them increasingly be able to leave, so they are expected to get a job before they graduate the program, and they're given permission to visit their families. And this is sort of built into the system, but the staff obviously show very mixed feelings about having women do this. And it suggests that they are not ready to participate in society. And so it has that citizenship suspending capacity as well, and that it prevents engagement with the full range of citizenship activities. Okay, so I'll take Michelle's question first about the men's facilities. I guess I really can't officially say because I didn't study men's facilities. Uh, Gladstone Lodge actually ran a men's program, but they kept them very rigidly separate. And so I have some insight based on what staff told me about what they do with men in that program. And but WTS was completely all women and did not have any services or any things for men. There are a couple of other studies done by other scholars of programs that either serve only men or mostly men, which suggest that you see in the criminal justice system treatment programs that don't have as much emphasis on kind of emotional autonomy, on codependency, on trauma. They tend not to focus on those things and to focus more on questions of personal responsibility, getting a job, not being prone to anger or other forms of strong emotions. So basically controlling emotions. And those, I think the message of a lot of the studies of mostly men's penal rehabs suggest that they kind of want men to grow up and get a job, would be like their sort of their bottom line. So they're not worried so much about men's like self-esteem or like digging into their, traumatic relationships with their mothers or something. And so I think you see that gender difference in the criminal justice system. And that would be part of it. I mean, the WTS is also expressly a gender sensitive program, which means that it's intending to target what they think are women's gender specific needs. And gender specific treatment in terms as a philosophy is not something that's there for men, which is a sign of the way that the sort of men and masculinity is the kind of unmarked standard category, which gets standard treatment, and then women get the sort of gender specific treatment. As far as I know, there's not gender specific sort of, or gender informed treatment for men in the criminal justice system. So there's that difference that I think comes out of looking at other studies and looking at where you get the kind of influence of the most self-esteem, trauma-oriented therapy for, in the criminal justice system, it's only for women. So even if you look at, like, say, the COMPAS risk assessment tool, which some of you may know, which is used to determine parole decisions and how high risk or medium or low risk an offender, so to speak, is ranked, will shape the kind of supervision that they're subject to when by parole. And so in the COMPAS tool, there is like a gender specific aspect of the risk assessment that's only for women. And there they ask about things like bad relationships, domestic violence, trauma, relationships with your children, family, the sorts of things that they just completely ignore for men. So I think the idea that men have kind of feelings and needs that are about their self-esteem or trauma is just completely ignored, basically, as far as I can tell in the criminal justice system. In terms of the private pay kind of places, there's really, really we know very little. As far as I know, this is the only ethnographic study done in a private pay rehab in, I don't know, 30 years probably. And most of the studies that have been done on treatment programs since the 70s are on treatment programs that serve mostly marginalized populations. So they're targeting homeless people, or they're in the criminal justice system, that kind of thing. At the Lodge, their men's program would have run fairly similarly in its emphasis on substance abuse, and it's like that they would hew to the 12-step line. That would be their sort of standard thing. Not all treatment programs are quite so old school in their really heavy 12-step emphasis, although it is still the dominant model in the field. And it's possible that outside of that model, which is like, people are quite doctrinaire about it at the Lodge, that you would potentially see kind of different practices for men, but I wouldn't know. So Patricia Hickling asks, I'm wondering how the two therapeutic settings treat the element of coercion in their programs. Well, the criminal justice program has so much more power to coerce its clients. I mean, just enormous, like the prison is hanging over their heads. So if the women fail in treatment, they get referred back to parole or to the drug court, and certain infractions will be treated within the program, even if they are reported to those authorities. But if you do something bad enough, you can get kicked out of WTS, and that can get a woman sent back to jail or prison, and often did, or to a more restrictive facility, one that might actually be more prison-like, like a locked facility. And so that would be, sort of that background with the prison hanging over their heads, as well as the loss of their children for many women, gives the program a tremendous amount of power to coerce women. And they used it. They also instituted a whole set of practices that resemble more standard kind of punishments. So they would do things when they felt like the group of women, what they called the house, were kind of out of control or wild, or there had been too many disciplinary infractions. They would close the house, as they called it, which meant that the women had to be in therapeutic groups for 16 to 18 hours a day. All visits to family, work, and other appointments were canceled, and they were banned from speaking to one another outside of group. There were a whole bunch of other restrictions, including like increased cleaning duty and things like that. So they would institute these sorts of punishments, which are standard practice in therapeutic community habilitation style programs, in order to compel compliance, in order to force confession of things. They did occasionally use intense confrontation groups. I didn't really see the most intense kind that you can see recounted in other people's research, but in which clients are singled out and sort of have criticism hurled at them by staff members and their fellow clients, in order to kind of provoke a very strong response, with the idea of breaking down the self and kind of getting under women's defense mechanisms. So they would use all those kinds of very coercive, demeaning tactics. And there was little, that could be done with it, against it, by the clients. They could abscond like Denisha did, but she very likely lost custody of her daughter after doing that. So that's a pretty heavy burden. At the lodge, they did not have as much power over clients for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is that the clients were customers, really, and so they could just take their business elsewhere. Although, in practice, that's a hard sell for people. It causes all these insurance problems, and there may not be places close. A lot of women wanted themselves to avoid programs that had heavy presence of poor women criminal justice clients, and so they liked that the lodge was a private pay place. So they were free to move, and sometimes they did. I did, in the book, I recount a story of a woman I called Jenny, who had just gotten out of an eating disorder clinic and was told that she needed to get her substance abuse under control, and so she went to the lodge, and was, after a week, was leaving. So I asked her why, and she said to me, she's like, they don't do real therapy here, and just the 12 steps. And she wanted something that was a more cognitive behavioral approach. So she went to some other treatment facility, and they could lose people. The lodge had to, the Faye, who was the sort of woman of the married couple who ran the lodge, would always introduce herself, not just as, hi, I'm Faye and I'm an alcoholic, which she also did, but she would say, thank you for choosing Gladstone Lodge, which is a sign that they had to please their customers, and that they knew that they were competing in a business where other facilities were swankier, had better had better, nicer beds, and they were fancier places, basically. And so they had to be nicer. They also had less power just because people stayed for only a month, so they didn't have the ability to kind of pull their clients away from work, family for the extended period of time. The one piece of leverage that I guess the lodge had that WTS didn't was that they were in an isolated rural area, and you could, I guess, run away from the lodge, but you'd have to walk a long way to get even to a convenience store, and so it wasn't easy to leave. They were very isolated where they were. So unless someone was going to come and pick you up and kind of rescue you from the lodge, if you wanted to run off, it was much harder. But the 1 month treatment time period, some people would pay more to stay for 3 months, but the vast majority of people stayed about 1 month. And that just gives them less hold over the women. Thank you, everyone. And thank you for listening and tuning in to my talk. I really appreciate it.